to help you deal with those situations where you're dealing with rock hard bunkers or bunkers that just have a lot of dirt in them and you're just basically playing off hardpan. I've got 5 things that can hopefully help you deal with that. And let's go over those things. The first is it's really important to understand some basics about the wedge and what it does and what the different parts of the wedge will help you do. So when you're looking at a wedge here, there's a couple parts that are really important to take note in regards to bunkers. So first, here is this point where the club face comes down to the bottom here. There's this pointy part right here. This is called the leading edge, and it's kind of sharp like that. And then on the bottom here, there's this curvy part. This curvy part right here called the bounce. And those, I think, have been appropriately called the digger and the skipper. And why those are called that is if you're playing a shot, if you have the shaft a little bit more forward, or maybe the ball is back in your stance, and that's, for whatever reason, the shaft is more forward. If you're coming down into the ball, this pointy part here, the leading edge, is going to have a propensity to dig into the ground and grab into it. So it requires really precise ball striking to be able to when you got the shaft forward like that. Whereas if you got the shaft a little bit more vertical or just slightly forward, there's this, as it comes into the ground, there's this bounce is literally going to help deflect and prevent the ball or prevent the club from digging into the ground. So when you're dealing with situations like this where you got rock hard bunkers, you're playing from almost bare dirt, you want to, so first it's important to understand that because we're going to use, set up to use that in a way that's going to really help with these hardpan situations. So that's the first part I want to cover. The second part is you'll probably want to use the wedge with lesser amount of bounce. If you go from, say, a lob wedge to a sand wedge to a gap wedge to a pitching wedge, the sand wedge is probably going to have the most amount of bounce on it. So when you go back to our first point there where the bounce helps skip the ball, skip the club and keep it from digging, in this situation where sand is really hard and it's like dirt basically, you probably don't want to use the sand wedge because it's may lead to the club skipping into the ball and you skull the ball. So you don't want to do that. So it's probably a better idea to pick out a lob wedge. In this particular case, I have a lob wedge here. So you can either use a lob wedge or a gap wedge or a pitching wedge. And the pitch, gap, and lob will most likely have less bounce. In the case of our Sterling irons here, they definitely do have less bounce. The sand wedge does have the most bounce. So if you need a shot that goes a little bit higher, then pick out the lob wedge. If you need one that goes a little bit lower or maybe a little bit farther, then maybe grab your gap wedge or pitching wedge. So that's the second point, is club selection can actually help you better hit these rock hard bunkers, hard pan type situations. So that's the second thing. The third thing I want to cover is you may want to have a little bit more shaft lean. And again, going back to our first point there, where the more the shaft is leaned a little forward, the more this club can dig into the ground. So with bunker shots, with normal shots, you want to hit the ball first and then maybe scrape the ground or take a divot. With bunker shots, you actually want to hit the sand first, and the sand, this deflected, will effectively spray or kind of lift the ball out of the bunker. So with your hardpan situation here, a little bit more shaft lean when you set up or coming into the ball. Not so much set up, but more when you're coming into the ball, can help the club get down into that hard sand and help you better play it. So that's the third thing, sorry. And then the fourth thing, similarly, if you don't necessarily, you can lean the shaft forward, you don't necessarily have to, but you definitely probably, nice phrase there. You probably don't want to open the club face. So normally when it's square like this, the leading edge is straight, and then when you open the club face to maybe hit a higher shot, or we're often taught in bunkers to open the club face so that we're using the bounce more. So in this particular situation where you're dealing with, again, super hard ground, opening up that club face to expose the bounce more is something that's not really a good idea. Generally not really a good idea. And then the last thing I just wanted to say is that with bunker shots, say you have your ball here, you want to hit the sand, coming down into the sand, maybe about an inch or 2 inches, maybe 3. There's a range where you can get down and hit it and still be okay. So the closer up to the ball you hit, the more it's going to fly and spin, and the farther back you hit, the less it's going to fly and more it's going to roll. So either one of those, as long as you're hitting into a pretty narrow window here, are going to end up resulting in about the same distance on the shot. You don't want to get too far back, like maybe 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 inches, because then you're just going to hit the dirt. In this case, we're talking about hardpan. We're going to hit the hard sand, dirt, and the ball's just not going to come out. You got to get up reasonably close to it, not too close to it, roughly 1 inch to 3 inches behind it, and that's about all I want to say about that. So just to recap, for these hardpan bunker type situations, understand what the leading edge does, understand what the bounce does. In this, when you pick out a wedge, pick out the one with the least amount of bounce. With our Sterling irons, it's either going to be your lob wedge, your gap wedge, or a pitching wedge. You could even use 9 or 8 or any of the other irons, but you probably don't want to use the sand wedge because it has the most bounce. You can have a little bit of extra shaft lean that'll help the club dig into this harder sand. And then you want to keep the club face more square versus opening it up and exposing the bounce. Again, this all boils down to understanding what the wedge does and how it works and how it interacts with the ground. And then you want to hit roughly 1 to 2, 3 inches behind it, and that's generally a pretty good spot to hit it in. So understand your wedge, use the wedge with the least amount of bounce, have a little bit extra shaft lean, keep the club face square, don't open it, and then hit 1 to 3 inches behind the ball. Try those things when you got those hardpan situations, those rock hard dirt bunkers, and hopefully you'll be getting out of those a little bit better.